Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. Hope you've had a great week so far. As promised, we're going to dive off into a subject that maybe a lot, I haven't taught this in a long time in here. It's probably been 10 years or 15 years, I don't know. And the makeup of the church has changed some since the last time I taught this class. But one thing you notice here is we don't use instruments. Now, I wasn't raised that way, obviously. I was raised in the Baptist church and the Catholic church, so I'm very used to instruments in worship. I'm very used to choirs. I'm very used to major big organs and all kinds of other things. And obviously, I wasn't raised in the church, and the first time I ever walked into a Church of Christ was about 1981 or so. And it was in this old building right here. I went this way. And I went with Susie and sat down in the back, and I thought, this sure is a nice building. I wonder why they can't afford a piano. So I never knew there was such a thing as anybody that didn't use instruments. Never thought anything about it my entire life, because I was in the kids' choir, I was in the middle of all that stuff. So anyway, it is different. And although I feel like it's one of maybe the least important ways that sets us apart, I feel like our leadership, our autonomy, our giving, a lot of other things set us apart from almost every other congregation. It is something you notice. So I'm going to present you, and Brent kind of doesn't like me giving the historical side of it so much, but I think it's important you understand it. And I'm going to present to you historically and then give you the reason why we don't. You might not agree with me. Years ago, and I've got that questionnaire still, I might even hand it out to let you fill it out. When I started in the church 30, 40 years ago, whatever that's been, 40-something years ago, I know this church, you couldn't even use instrumental music in a wedding or a funeral. That, of course, has changed over the course of history, over my lifetime. And Clyde was one of the elders that was involved in that decision. We're pretty unique. Now, there's other people that don't use instruments, obviously. Most Jews, most synagogue worship is non-instrumental. Greek Orthodox is non-instrumental. Primitive Baptists are non-instrumental. For the most part, Church of the Firstborn are non-instrumental. So there's a lot of people that are non-instrumental besides us. But one of the first questions you're going to get asked if you ever invite somebody to come to worship with you is, why don't you use instruments? That's just because that's the first thing people are going to notice. And the next thing they're probably going to ask you is, what's this bread and juice coming around? We've already done communion in here, so hopefully you got the answer to that now. Those are questions you're going to get because we're different than most other people. For those things specifically, people notice that in worship, is that those things are different. And so you get those questions. So singing is different for us. As you can see, and of course, we're autonomous. So there's other churches of Christ that do use instruments. There's other churches of Christ that do things differently. But like I've said, when we was talking about church leadership, we're an autonomous congregation. We're governed by our eldership, and that's the decision at this particular congregation. So doesn't mean you're not going to find an instrument if you go to a Church of Christ someplace else. You might. You might. So you never know that. So, and I don't know how important doctrinally this is to you. I don't know if this will make it more important to you or less important to you or not change your mind. But all I can do is present you with some history, present you with why we don't, and kind of give you an idea of why. And then it might be kind of fun. I was thinking at the end of this, it might be kind of fun just to do a little singing class type thing, because whether you guys know it or not, we're shape note singers. Does everybody here know that? Does anybody in here know that? Huh? We're shape note singers. Does anybody in here know that? Put a song up. Shannon, put something up. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. Put something up. We're shape note singers. And what that means is that when you see these songs in your book or on the screen, every note has a shape, okay? And every shape is a sound. So you don't have to know music to sing these songs. If you know the shapes, then you can sing them. Because every shape is a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So if you know what shape represents which musical note, then you know how to sing it. It's like that Sound of Music. Has everybody in here seen the Sound of Music? When Julie Andrews does the do, deer, female deer, and when she's in the wagon and she points to them and they're like, do, do, fa, la, mi. I already like that show, by the way, so I can tell you. But she just points to them and they sing their do right until they get the song. And then she goes, when we know the notes to play, we can sing most anything, right? Well, and we'll talk about this later. It's really in the class tonight, but next time you sing, notice that every note has a shape. Like right there, you see that upside down triangle right there? That's do. Okay, that's re. See. So when you see every note, and I might put that up at the end of this, but I know a lot of you don't know that, but that's what we are, and that's our history. If you go back to Church of Christ history, shape notes are part of what we are, and so. Interestingly, even on our PowerPoint slides are shape notes, in your book they're shape notes, but every note is a tone. So we might talk about that a little bit at the end of this, just for kicks and giggles. But next time you sing, just notice that. Every note is a different shape. So, and every shape corresponds to a musical note, to a musical tone. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So, yeah. Well, it doesn't matter if you're in a bass scale, then you're still, the do is still the same. Like a lot of songs, like Put Up the Battle Belongs to the Lord. Put Up the Battle Belongs to the Lord. And I'll kind of give you I'll give you something to look at anyway. We'll talk about this a little more if you have an interest in it. If you don't, we won't. But, okay, this is kind of a unique song because in this song, the bass line and the lead, if you call it. So we have four scales, right? We have tenor, alto. We have soprano, alto, tenor, bass, okay? So soprano and alto are on the top scale. That's your treble clef, okay? Wrong button. That's your treble clef right here. That is your soprano and your alto. Now, if you'll notice, they sing exactly the same notes on this song. Do you see that? There's not two separate line of notes. Now, the bottom one is the bass scale. That's right here. That's your bass scale. And that's your tenors and your basses. And if you'll notice in this particular song, the reason I put that up, if you look really closely, you'll notice that this shape and 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 this shape are all the same shapes. You notice that? There's no treble bass, you see. In other words, when we sing this song, all of us are singing the same note. You see? Does that make any sense? All of us are singing the same notes. When we sing this song, in heavenly armor will enter the land. We're all singing exactly the same thing because it's all exactly the same note. Even though it's a treble and a bass scale, does that make any sense? We're on the same exact tone because it's the same. Does that make any sense at all, what I'm trying to say? Put up, greatest commands. So if you look at this song has an alto lead. So when the very first line, when you sing this song, if you look right up there at that number 1, it says alto. That's telling you it's an alto lead. So when you sing this song, the first people that sing are the women, the altos. Love one another, for love is of God, right? Then go to the second verse. And then in the second verse, you get the bass. So you see alto and bass. See it up there at the top? So your alto is your treble line, and your bass is your bass clef line. Okay, so the alto is singing, love one another, and the bass is singing, you know, love bears all things. So you got a bass line. Now go to the next one. So then the next one, you pick up the tenor. So that's the other man line. That's the tenor line. So you have the alto singing their line, you have the bass singing their line, and then the tenor comes in. God is love, God is love, God is love. And then the next verse, you pick up the soprano. So when you pick up the soprano, then they're singing the soprano part. So in that particular song, as we go through the song, we pick up every individual part. So anyway, we'll talk more about this. It's really not the class tonight, but that's kind of how this works. We're called four-part harmony. Okay, four-part harmony. And I want to tell you, when four-part harmony first came on the scene, people really resisted that too. So we'll talk about that. Okay, go back to my lesson now. Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, that's absolutely a pianist or a guitar or whatever you want to play. It's still the same exact scale. A, B, C, D, E, F. It's exactly the same scale as you would play with a musical instrument. But since we don't use instruments, we use our voice. Instead of us thinking A, B, C, D, E, we think do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You see? Does that make any sense? Because we don't use an instrument. So to us, C means nothing to me, or A or B. Well, it does because I've played trumpet, so I kind of know notes anyway. But basically, we don't care about A, B, C, D, E, F. We don't care about that. We care about do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And then when we pitch, when a song leader pitches a song, and you'll see them up here, and they'll pitch, right? If you see somebody do that, I always do it. I'm like Junior Bailey. He says, you sing like I do by the letter. He says, you just stand up and let her go, which is kind of what I do. But you'll see some of those guys use a pitch pipe. So what they do, we can't really sing. Put up, His Grace Reaches Me. You know, that's a great example. That's a song we can't sing. If you were to pitch that by a piano, we would never make this song. We couldn't do it. Our sopranos, we don't have any Allegra sopranos in here, right? You ain't got anybody who can hit it. It's too high. So when we pitch, you pick that. Most song leaders, if they use the pitch pipe, will take that note on that line and drop it at least one note. We always sing a little below. We generally sing a little bit below the actual key because you have to get it where people can hit it. And if you pitch too high, as you know, it's a real struggle. So, and if you pitch too low, it's a real struggle. But people don't care about that because they figure us basses have got it. But we don't always, because sometimes you get below a bass. But that's how you pitch. So when you teach people to lead singing, you always tell them to go. Every good boy does fine, right? The lines, right? If you're a piano person, and you always teach them to go one note, generally one or two notes below the key, is generally where we sing. Because if you, like I said, especially on a song like this, if you get to the bottom of this song, right here, symphony, and it thrills my soul just to feel. If you really pitch that with a piano, we would never hit that note. So whenever a song leader leads, part of leading is pitching. You need to be able to pitch it where people can sing it. So generally, if you pick out a song to lead, you go through it, find the lowest note, the highest note, and try to make sure you get something that everybody can hit. So anyway, back to the class. We'll talk about this more later. Something to think about, though. Kind of fun. Okay, so anyway, why do we do it? Well, I'm going to start with this, and I didn't hand this out, and I kind of think I know how it will go, quite a bit different than what it went 15 years ago in here probably. And all these things are questions that, I've had posed to me over the years. And some people don't listen to even an instrumental religious song, even if it's not here. In their car or their home, they won't listen to there's a lot of members, a lot of people won't even listen to any religious song instrumental. What we sing is called a cappella, right, as the church. Do you believe it's all right when the assemblies met mostly brethren at the building to use instrumental music or funeral or wedding? Like I said, we do that here. There was a point in history we didn't do that. There was a point in history that people, and I've had people get very upset with me, especially at funerals, over using instruments in a funeral, because they're like, well, we're all here. So we kind of got to define what worship is and where we use it and where we don't. And that's a question that's been raised here. If you don't believe me, talk to Clyde. He will tell you. Some people, even if we're home, like there's home churches, and sometimes people think, like if we all get together at a house and somebody breaks out a guitar and sings religious songs, that's a problem, and some people don't. Some people think that it's a sin to have instruments. Some people think that it's salvational to have instruments. Some people think it's a sin for a Christian to play Christian music on an instrument. Some people think that it's a salvational issue, and you could be condemned for using instruments in worship. You could be condemned for that on the day of judgment. I'm not answering these questions for you. I am posing them to you. So what do we do? Historically, what's the history of instruments? Well, even in Judaism, instruments were used primarily up until the destruction of the Second Temple, at which point, after Babylonian captivity, Judaism went into synagogue worship, and instruments predominantly even today are not used in synagogue worship, although there is one instrument that's used, the ram horn, which is the shofar, which is what Jeff carries with him, that's used sometimes to signal the beginning of the end of a religious day, but very few synagogues, even though some synagogues now do, because some synagogues have got more liberal, but Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox synagogues still do not use instruments in worship. We do, and so historically, even though in the Psalms we talk about David using instruments and other things, after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Babylonians, instrumental music pretty well went away from worship in Judaism. Judaic culture has preserved some melodies that may go back to 500 BC. The Psalm of David and the Song of Solomon were sung. The Song of Solomon, even though not a book we read much or study much, the Song of Solomon is considered one of the greatest preserved Hebrew poetry books in the world. So, and even though we do not read it in Hebrew, so it does not read the same to us, Song of Solomon is canonized into the Old Testament. We know of an early presence of professional musicians, both responsorial, a soloist answered by a congregation, and antiphonial, alternating congregational groups. Styles were used in singing the Psalms. After the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish music became exclusively vocal after 70 AD. As it dispersed, and that has changed a small amount today. As it dispersed and transient Jews would learn the human voice is a readily portable instrument, and communal singing serves to bond as participants in both form and purpose. Like the Egyptians, Jewish singers may have shared musical directions and reminders with hand signs. Cantillation, which if you've ever talked about synagogue, Jewish worship, there's cantors. Cantillation, if you want to listen to that, you can pull that up. The intoning of sacred texts using ancient melodic formulae written with symbols was an important musical format. Jewish prayer chants, which were based on ancient melodic lines and often highly ornamented, would have a considerable influence on Christian planchet. Why? Because Christian worship, first century Christian worship, predominantly evolved out of synagogue worship. So that's how come it kind of went that way. We came out of synagogue for the most part. So that's one reason that we stayed with that basic idea. The Jews often sing their prayers. This is the Shema. And a lot of Jews sing this for a morning prayer. It's Deuteronomy 6. And hear, O Israel, the eternal one is our God, the eternal God alone. It's Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai, Echad. So we sing. So they sing morning prayers, and that's common. It's common in Islam, common in Judaism. We're not prayer singers in the New Testament church. My wife can sing prayers. I can't. But that's predominantly what we kind of came out of. That's part of our history, part of where this evolved. The difference is singing prayers in Judaism, singing prayers in Islam became more ritualistic and came more tradition and came more the idea of something you had to do to please God. They weren't necessarily so much flow from the heart, prayer from the heart, different prayers. They were things that were memorized. We see that in Islam, and we definitely see that in Judaism also. And so that's the kind of thing. I think that's one reason that prompted Jesus' apostles, Jesus' disciples to say, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples, because they saw Jesus' prayers were substantially different than the sung prayers or memorized prayers of Judaism, and they wanted to know how to do that. So I think there was a difference there, and I think that's how come they made that statement. So anyway, back to music. So the first 1,000 years of Christianity, all hymns in the church were sung without instruments. This style of singing came to be known as a cappella, also spelled a cappella, meaning of the church and in the style of the church. So for 10 centuries, there were no instruments. So what happened? Well, what happened was eventually an instrument, well, that slide kind of got messed up. An instrument became used. The first appearance of instrumental music in church worship was about the 6th century AD. The exact date of its introduction varied in different localities, but it can safely be concluded that there was no general practicing of it until after the 8th century. And even after this date, it was long resisted by leading religionists. The quotations to follow represent historical information about the practice of the primitive church regarding music. The scholars who are quoted all concur that instrumental music was not part of the worship of the primitive church. So from Schaff Herzog, it says, and that's from it says in the Greek church, which is Greek Orthodox, and Greek Orthodox still is non-instrumental. In the Greek Orthodox, the organ never came into use, but after the 8th century, it became common in the Latin church, the Western church, which had been Roman Catholicism. And if you've been in my church history classes here, you know that we're basically Western religionists, not Eastern, but Western. So our influence is Roman Catholicism, not Greek Orthodox. It says, not however without opposition from the side of the monks. The Reformed Church discarded it, and though the Church of Basel very early introduced it, in other places admitted only sparingly, and after long hesitation. So the idea of using instruments in worship was not something that was originally done, and it took centuries before that actually started to happen. John Calvin, which you've been in my history classes, you know who John Calvin is. John Calvin was an early reformist, and most of the religion in the United States is Calvinistic, as I've told you. John Calvin says, musical instruments to celebrating the praise of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting up of the lamps, the restoration of other shadows of the law. The Papists, therefore, have foolishly borrowed this, as well as many other things from the Jews. And that's from John Calvin's commentary. Adam Clarke, who was a big Methodist reformist, about the same time as Calvin. Adam Clarke, the greatest commentator of all time on the Methodists. I'm an old man, an old minister, and I here declare that I never knew them productive of any good in the worship of God, and have had reason to believe that they are productive of much evil. Music is a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and here I register my protest against all such corruptions in the worship of the author of Christianity. And that's from Clarke's commentary. John Wesley, who was a great Methodist reformer, John Wesley said, I have no objection to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. Martin Luther, which is the reformist that started the Lutheran Church, German, called the organ an ensign of Baal. Church of England, make melody with the music of your heart to the Lord. Let your songs be not the drinking of heathen feasts, but psalms and hymns and their accompaniment, not the music of the lyre, but the melody of the heart. And the reason I bring this up is not because these guys are inspired, so don't take it that, but I'm trying to give you a basis of kind of how this all went down, and the idea that, you know, early reformers were really opposed to the instrument. So the idea of it coming in was something that met a tremendous amount of opposition in the Reformation movement. Zwingli, who broke the altar, who broke the organ into pieces in the streets, was a talented musician, but he said that the instrument was no better than an idol, and he pulled the instrument out in Zurich, Switzerland. He pulled the instrument out of the church and broke it to pieces in the street, and the history records that the organist wept because he broke the organ apart in the middle of the street. He believed that it was an idol, and that it shouldn't be in an instrument, it shouldn't be in worship because it was an idol, and no different than any other idol, should not be in the worship of God. So this is a primitive Baptist preacher, and I don't know if you're familiar with primitive Baptists. There's some in Arkansas, Missouri. They're a little different group, but this is from a primitive Baptist preacher in Arkansas. I found this many years ago, and I kind of stuck it on here. The above religious leaders, not one of whom was a member of the Primitive Baptist Church, have been quoted, not for the purpose of proving instrument music and the worship wrong, but to show the fact that Christ left it out proves that, but to show that the practice of having instrumental music in the worship service has been rejected by many religious leaders of the world. If no one taught instrumental music in the worship wrong, it would not change the New Testament teaching. But it is interesting to note that historians, encyclopedists, and religious leaders are agreed that the music characteristic of the New Testament is the music characteristic of primitive Baptist churches. If you've ever sat through my church history class, which we did on Sunday morning just recently, you'll know that one thing I said about the Church of Christ is when Campbell and Stone really started this movement, their idea was to copy the New Testament church. They wanted us to look as close as we could to the church of the first century, church of the New Testament. Well, historically, beyond a doubt, if you want to look like the first century church, you're non-instrumental. Because there's no doubt historically, it did not exist in the first century Christian church, did not exist. So that's one reason I bring up history, because if you remember right, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to restore, not to reform, but to restore. And that's one thing that they did was they said, you know, if you're going to look like the first century church, you're going to be non-instrumental. So that was part of that reasoning, why that wasn't brought in, until even quite a bit longer in that. In the Old Testament, we know there was instruments. We understand that. We're not an Old Testament church. We're a New Testament church, and we worship in a New Testament way. So a lot of people bring up, you know, the Psalms, bring up David playing the harp, David playing instruments for the Lord. But once again, you know, as you read in that one, that'd be no different than us burning incense and doing sacrifice and doing a lot of other things of the Old Testament. We don't do, because we know that's not required of us anymore. In Exodus 15, you see where they sang also, "I'll sing to the Lord." Exodus 15:21, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Music to the Lord is as old probably as time itself, I would say. This is some of the very first examples we have of music in the Bible. But, you know, the idea that it didn't exist before this probably would not be true. A lot of music in the Old Testament was songs from the heart, songs of praise that flowed from the heart, like the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel, the Song of Miriam, the Song of Moses, songs of praise, of thanksgiving. Even if you look to the New Testament, the Magnificat of Mary is something that could be sung. It's in that poetic prose, so something that could be sung if that was so desired to do that. But in the New Testament, what do we know? If you remember right from my church history class and from this doctrine class, if you remember, in the very beginning of this, I said, how do we determine doctrine, right? That was the very start of this class. How do we determine doctrine? And I said, well, there's several ways, right? One is command. If the Bible commands us to do it, then we know to do it, right? The Bible says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. That's a command. We understand that to be a command. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. That's a command. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's a command. We have commands. The other thing I said we do it is by apostolic example. Remember that? If the apostles did it, then we take that to be our example. Why do we take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? Not because the Bible anywhere says, thou shalt take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, right? But because in Acts 27 and 1 Corinthians, our apostolic example is that the early church met on the first day of the week to break bread. And we take that example to be doctrinally binding, right? Why do we give? Because there's examples in the Bible, apostolic examples of giving. So we know it's okay to give. No different with singing. Apostolic examples of singing. The apostles sang at different times. If you remember, there's one other thing I told you about determined doctrine that makes us a little different than other places and other denominations. And that is we take the silence of the Scripture to be authoritative. Remember that? We just don't say, God doesn't have to say, thou shalt not. If it doesn't authorize it, we believe it's prohibited. So in this case, in the New Testament, we have to look at all these New Testament scriptures, and we have to say, how did these people sing in the New Testament? In the first century church, how did they sing? Right? Now, they could have played when they sang, and there's even Greek words that can be used for playing and singing together. None of those Greek words are used in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the word for sing is having solo, is to pluck the strings of the heart, okay? So in Acts 16:25, it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. In 1 Corinthians 14:15, he says, so what shall I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I also will sing with my understanding. You see, music in the Bible has a purpose. It's not just to make us feel good. It's not just to give us fuzzy feelings inside. Music in the Bible has a purpose. It's to teach and admonish each other. We're supposed to be using it for a reason. The Bible commands all of us to sing, right? We're all to sing. We're all to sing from our heart. Doesn't matter if we can carry a tune or not. Some people can carry a tune, some people can't carry a tune. That's all right. God hears our heart, doesn't hear a tune. And so let's look at some other examples. In Hebrews 2:12, he says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters in the presence of the assembly. I will sing your praises. In James 5:13, is any among you in trouble? Let him pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. I'm going to give you every New Testament scripture that says to sing. In Ephesians, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. The Bible tells us where music comes from our heart. Not from an instrument, from our heart. He says to speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs of the Spirit. So when we sing here, we're not just singing to make a sound to God. We're singing to encourage one another. We're singing to instruct one another. We're singing to teach one another. So we sing a lot of different kinds of songs, just like they did in the New Testament. They sing psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, or if you read King James, spiritual songs. Different types. So they would sing the psalms. We sing songs that are the psalms when we sing. It says they sing hymns, which predominantly would be scriptural songs or songs that contain Scripture, which we sing, and then also songs from the Spirit, or we would probably call those praise songs, songs from the heart. In Colossians 3, it says, the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. So the Bible tells us that we're all to sing, yeah. We do sing psalms. Yeah, we do sing psalms.
Praise the Lord in his sanctuary, praise him in his mighty heavens, praise him for his mighty deeds, praise him according to his excellent greatness. Praise him with a trumpet sound, praise him with a lute and a harp, praise him with a tambourine and dance, praise him with strings and pipe, praise him with the sounding cymbals, praise him with clashing cymbals. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord.
Yeah, and in an Old Testament sense, they did use, in the time of David, they did use instruments.
Yeah, because it says psalm, so that's psalm.
Well, it says to sing the psalms, doesn't say to play them.
And then it says on the Ephesians 5:19, it says, sing and make music from the heart.
And pluck the strings of the heart, solo in the Greek.
So, I mean, it's saying singing is singing and making music from the heart. So if you're playing, like you said, you're a trumpet player, you could be playing trumpet from your heart in honoring God. I'm not saying
Yeah, well, when we get into the Greek, which we'll get into Greek in this in just a minute, the Greek there is solo, and in the Greek, that is plucking the strings of the heart, the instrument of the heart. So when we sing, it's supposed to be from our heart. It's supposed to be to each other. It's supposed to be to God. It's supposed to be from our heart. It's supposed to be singing in worship is not a show. It's not supposed to be a show. Just like nothing else in worship is supposed to be a show. It's just not supposed to be. That's not what worship is about. Worship is not about entertaining ourselves. It's not about a show. Worship is about coming together and spending time and worshiping to God, bowing before God, putting our heart, right? Bowing our heart before God. The very word worship is proskuneo, right? To prostrate ourselves before the Lord, right? Unfortunately, in my childhood, and I think in society today, worship has become a show. I mean, the bigger band we can put on stage and the bigger soundboard we can have and the more light show we can have and the bigger sound we can make and that's not what worship's supposed to be about. And I just don't, when I was a kid, man, I loved going into that cathedral. I mean, that big organ playing, that choir. I mean, it made me feel like I could reach up and touch God. You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, when I did that, it wasn't anything about God. It was about how Rex felt. I didn't think anything about how God felt about it or anything else. I thought, man, I really like this. You know what I'm saying? And when you and I worship, it's a danger in anything. It's a danger for me as a preacher. I mean, if I preach and becomes a show, becomes a show, then what have I done? I mean, what have I done? I mean, I hope my preaching can be engaging, but if I get up here and do a little dance and sing a little song and tell a few jokes, what have I done? I've disrespected God. I've disrespected this pulpit. I've disrespected your trust in me and your faith in me. I've done a great disservice. I mean, you might leave here thinking it's pretty funny, and maybe you had a good time, and you might walk out here saying, boy, that Rex is pretty funny. He's a pretty good speaker, whatever. Maybe you wouldn't because I can't tell very good jokes. But you might say he's really a bad joke teller, and he's so bad it's good. I don't know what you'd say. But once that becomes about me, then we failed. Does that make any sense? The day it becomes about Rex or the song leader, we failed. Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that, yeah, because I think that's been an issue for a long time. Where does it stop? Where does it start, So, yeah, that's something we have to talk about. And for some people, it doesn't stop. That's the reason at the beginning of that questionnaire, I was telling you, 30, 40 years ago, ask some of these guys, ask Gary, ask Clyde, ask Brent. 40 years ago, ask Tommy, ask Bill, ask any of us old-timers. 40 years ago, it was a lot different than it is today. There was people 40 years ago that they would not listen to a religious song on the radio. If it had instruments, they wouldn't listen to religious music in their house. They wouldn't play music instruments at a funeral. They wouldn't do it at a wedding. We had many people in this congregation that didn't get married in our building because we wouldn't let them play a wedding march for a wedding. Yeah, we're not that way anymore because I think we kind of got to define what worship is, and I'm glad Gary's here. Hope he's here next week. Hope Clyde's here next week. Hope Brent's here next week because these are questions that these guys have tremendous knowledge, and I kind of fumble along, but I think, we're about out of time, but, when you think about what you do when you come up here to worship, anytime you leave this worship, what's on your mind is not God. What's on your mind is Rex or a song leader or that person sitting next to you or that baby sitting over there or when we failed. I'm just telling you, we failed. because worship is about God. Plain and simple, 100%, it's about God. I love to sing. I love to sing. Yeah. Yeah, well, I love to sing. I mean, but I love, and I'm going to tell you as we close, I do not miss an instrument. I grew up with it, and when I very first came here, I did. But now, whenever I go to a funeral or if I go someplace that uses an instrument, it is in my way. I'm just telling you. I'm waiting on them to get done so I can start, and I'm waiting on them to lead in so I can start. And the other thing I noticed, and this is just Rex's observation, you don't have to agree with me, when I was a kid and I was in the Baptist church or the Catholic church, we didn't sing. I mean, we kind of sang. We kind of mouthed the words. We didn't sing because the organ was playing, the piano was playing, there was a choir up here singing for us. We just sort of, wah, 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 wah. We didn't sing. When we sang here, and this is just me too, but Sunday nights here are the best, it's the best singing here. You got more people on Sunday morning, Sunday nights is the best singing. But when we sing here, and especially when we're singing good, it's amazing. Because the only thing we're hearing is our voices. The only thing we're hearing, right? And that is an amazing experience to me. And I just, I grew up with it. And when I first started coming to the Church of Christ, it really bothered me not having an instrument. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. It bothered me because I'm a music guy. I mean, you know me. You know I am. I love music. I listen to music. I play a little music. Not very good. But I'm a music guy. I love to sing. I love all that stuff. And, I was in the choir. I was in the kids' choir. I was in the adult choir. I sang solos at the Baptist church. I did all those things. And at the end of the day, I don't miss any of that. Because the point of it is, and somebody told me one time, they said, well, I'd come to your church if they'd let me sing. And I said, we all sing here. Like, that's not what I mean. If I could get up and sing a solo. And I said, why do you want to get up and sing a solo? Because if we leave this building talking about somebody instead of talking about God, then we've messed up. Right? So when I get up and preach, that's how come. I know I joke a little, kind of joke a little from the pulpit, but I don't tell no full-scale jokes. Y'all have heard me preach for 20 years. I don't get up and tell you a big joke for a punchline. And I try not to do anything that when you leave this, unless I mess up, that you leave here and talk about me, because that's not what you need to be talking about. If we can't direct our minds and our hearts and our attention and our focus, that's why we take communion. That's why we sing songs. That's why we do all those other things we do. That's why we pray. All that stuff's supposed to be directing our minds and our hearts and our lives towards God. And if we miss that, then we've missed the whole thing if we miss it. We really have. And I'm going to tell you, I'm out of time. My good friend who goes and sings at all these big churches all over the United States with his quartet, he's told me something, and it just stuck in me, and it burned in me. And he said, Rex, he goes, all these big churches, all these places I go, he says, they're not about worshiping anymore. He says, they're about putting on a good show, and they're about trying to get more people to sit in pews. He says, they forgot what it means to worship.